Welcome to the Long Road Stories. What you're about to hear is not fiction. This is a documented account from the highways of America, where the asphalt stretches through isolated mountains and the night holds secrets that defy explanation. Tonight, we bring you the story of James Porter, a veteran trucker who encountered something on Route 50 in West Virginia that no man should ever see. This is his story, exactly as it happened. Before we begin, if you enjoy these real highway mysteries, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what state or country you're watching from. We love hearing from truckers and road travelers all over the world. Now let's hit the road. James Porter had driven Route 50 through West Virginia. The Phantom Bride. James Porter had driven Route 50 through West Virginia exactly 43 times in his 18-year career as a long-haul trucker. He knew every curve, every grade, and every mile marker on that treacherous mountain highway. But nothing in those 43 previous trips prepared him for what happened on November 7th, 2023. Starting at exactly 11:58 at night, James began seeing her. A woman in a white wedding dress standing on the shoulder of the road, her arm extended in the universal gesture for hitchhiking. Her face was pale as moonlight, her dress stained and torn. James drove past without stopping, his instincts screaming danger. 42 minutes later, 31 miles down the road on a completely different stretch of highway, there she was again. Same woman, same dress, same dead expression on her cadaveric face. By the time the sun rose over the Appalachian Mountains, James Porter had seen the bride 6 times in locations that were physically impossible for any living person to reach. And he learned why the old truckers call Route 50 the Widow's Highway, and why so many drivers have disappeared along its fog-shrouded curves, their trucks found abandoned with engines running and doors hanging open. But no trace of the men who were driving them. The dispatch came through on a cold Tuesday evening at the truck stop in Charleston, West Virginia. James Porter was sitting in the driver's lounge, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and watching the weather report on the wall-mounted television. The forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s, perfect conditions for a night drive through the mountains. His phone buzzed with a text from dispatch supervisor Linda Matthews, a woman James had worked with for the past 12 years. She had a priority delivery that needed to reach Cumberland, Maryland by 8 in the morning. The route was straightforward, just over 200 miles up Route 50 through the Appalachian Mountains. The cargo was machinery parts for a manufacturing plant, nothing hazardous or particularly valuable, but the client was willing to pay premium rates for overnight delivery. James calculated the drive time in his head. With the mountain grades and winding roads, he estimated 6 to 7 hours of driving time, which would put him in Cumberland with an hour to spare. He texted Linda back, confirming he would take the load, finished his coffee, and walked out to the parking lot where his Freightliner Cascadia waited under the sodium vapor lights. James Porter was 46 years old, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending most of your adult life behind the wheel of a truck. He had started driving at age 28, after a brief career as a warehouse manager left him feeling trapped and unfulfilled. His ex-wife, Karen, had never understood his love for the road, never understood why he would choose weeks away from home over the comfort and stability of a 9-to-5 job. The divorce had been finalized 8 years ago, and James had thrown himself even deeper into his work. The road became his home, his truck, his sanctuary. He had a small apartment in Charleston that he visited maybe 6 days a month, just long enough to do laundry and restock supplies. The rest of his life was spent moving freight across America's highways, a modern nomad, following the same routes that wagon trains and pioneers had traveled centuries before. James prided himself on his safety record. In 18 years, he had never had a preventable accident, never missed a delivery deadline, and never received a moving violation. He was what the industry called a professional driver, someone who took the job seriously and treated every load like it was the most important cargo in the world. The machinery parts were already loaded and secured in his trailer when James performed his pre-trip inspection. He walked around the 53-foot trailer, checking the kingpin connection, the landing gear, and the trailer brake lines. He inspected each of the 18 tires, looking for any signs of damage or low pressure. He tested the trailer lights, watching as his running lights, brake lights, and turn signals all illuminated properly. Everything checked out perfectly. James climbed into the cab of his truck and started the engine, listening to the smooth rumble of the Cummins diesel motor. He adjusted his mirrors, checked that his CB radio was set to channel 19, and pulled up the GPS navigation on his dashboard screen. The route was simple enough. Take Route 60 north out of Charleston, then merge onto Route 50 east, and follow it all the way to Cumberland. Most of the drive would be through rural West Virginia, passing through small towns with names like Parkersburg and Clarksburg. The highway followed the old Northwestern Turnpike, a historic road that dated back to the early 1800s. James had driven it dozens of times and knew it was especially beautiful in the fall when the mountain forests blazed with autumn colors. Tonight, in early November, most of those leaves had already fallen, leaving the trees as dark skeletons against the night sky. James pulled out of the truck stop at 9:45 in the evening, merging smoothly into the light traffic on the highway. The first hour of driving was uneventful and almost meditative. James listened to a classic rock station on the radio, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm of old Eagles and CCR songs. The highway climbed gradually into the mountains, the elevation increasing with each passing mile. James downshifted smoothly as he approached steeper grades, using his engine brake to maintain safe speeds on the descents. Other vehicles were scarce at this time of night. He passed the occasional car heading in the opposite direction, their headlights flashing by in the darkness. A few semi-trucks passed him going west, their drivers flashing their lights in the traditional trucker greeting. James returned the gesture, a small moment of camaraderie between professionals who understood the unique challenges and rewards of life on the road. At 10:53, James passed through the small town of Parkersburg, its main street deserted, except for a single gas station with fluorescent lights blazing. He continued east, following Route 50 as it wound deeper into the Appalachian wilderness. The first wisps of fog appeared around 11:30. At first it was just thin tendrils drifting across the road like smoke, barely visible in his headlights. But as James climbed higher into the mountains, the fog grew thicker and more persistent. By 11:45, visibility had dropped to maybe a quarter mile, and James reduced his speed to 50 miles per hour, well below the posted 65-mile-per-hour limit. The fog in these mountains was notorious, forming suddenly as warm air from the valleys collided with cold air at higher elevations. James had driven through plenty of fog before and wasn't particularly concerned, but he remained alert, his eyes scanning constantly for deer or other hazards that might appear suddenly in the reduced visibility. The highway at this point was a two-lane road with one lane in each direction, no shoulder to speak of, and thick forest pressing close on both sides. Guardrails appeared on his right wherever the road skirted along the edge of a steep drop-off, their reflective markers glowing briefly as his headlights swept across them. The center line was freshly painted yellow, providing a reliable reference point in the fog. James focused on keeping his truck perfectly centered in his lane, maintaining steady speed, and watching for any oncoming traffic that might drift over the line. At 11:58, James crested a rise and began descending a long, gentle slope. His headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the road perhaps 200 feet ahead. That's when he saw her for the first time. Standing on the right shoulder, partially obscured by a drifting patch of fog, was a woman. She was wearing what appeared to be a white wedding dress, the long skirt hanging to her ankles. Her left arm was extended at shoulder height, thumb out in the classic hitchhiking gesture. James's first thought was confusion. What was a woman doing out here in the middle of nowhere at midnight? His second thought was concern. Route 50 in this area was at least 15 miles from the nearest town in either direction. If this woman was stranded, she could be in serious danger from exposure to the cold or from other threats that lurked in these isolated mountains. James's foot moved instinctively toward the brake pedal, his natural inclination to help someone in distress. But something stopped him. Something about the scene didn't feel right. As his truck approached and his headlights illuminated the woman more clearly, James felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. The woman's face was wrong. Her skin was paper white, almost luminescent in the darkness. Her eyes were dark hollows, and her expression was completely blank, showing no emotion or reaction to the approaching truck. The wedding dress she wore was stained with something dark that might have been mud or might have been something worse, and the fabric hung on her frame in a way that suggested the dress had been beautiful once, but was now ruined beyond repair. James's truck passed the woman at 50 miles per hour, and he watched her in his passenger side mirror until the fog swallowed her image. His heart was racing and his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The rational part of his mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe there had been a wedding at one of the small towns and the bride had an argument with her new husband. Maybe she was drunk or in shock and had wandered onto the highway. Maybe she needed medical attention. James reached for his CB radio microphone, intending to call out and see if any other drivers had seen the woman, or if anyone had information about an accident or emergency in the area. But before he could key the transmit button, a voice crackled through the CB speaker. It was rough and filled with static, barely comprehensible. Route 50 eastbound. Be careful. She's out tonight. The bride is walking. The transmission cut off abruptly. James keyed his microphone. This is Midnight Express eastbound on Route 50. Someone just transmitted about a bride. I just passed a woman in a wedding dress on the shoulder near mile marker 138. Can anyone confirm? He waited, but only silence answered him. James tried again. Midnight Express to any unit on Route 50. Does anyone copy? Still nothing. The CB radio returned to its usual background static, with no sign that anyone had heard his transmission or that the mysterious warning had ever been broadcast. James hung the microphone back on its clip and told himself he was letting the fog and the isolation get to him. The woman he had passed was probably just someone having a very bad night, and the CB transmission was probably a fragment from another frequency bleeding through. He would call the highway patrol when he got to the next town and report what he had seen. They could send someone to check on the woman and make sure she got whatever help she needed. James continued driving through the fog, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, and his mind troubled by the image of the woman in the wedding dress. The highway descended from the mountain pass and began following a river valley, the road hugging the contours of the terrain. At 12:19 in the morning, James passed through the tiny hamlet of Grafton, just a handful of buildings clustered around a railroad crossing. A single streetlight illuminated the intersection, and James could see a closed diner and what looked like an abandoned gas station. No other vehicles were visible, no signs of human activity. The town was as deserted as if everyone had simply vanished. James checked his GPS and noted that he had covered approximately 31 miles since passing the woman. He should reach the next sizable town, Clarksburg, in another 40 minutes or so. He would stop there and call the authorities about what he had seen. Satisfied with this plan, James settled back into his seat and tried to relax. The fog was beginning to thin slightly as the road descended to lower elevation, and visibility improved to perhaps half a mile. James allowed his speed to increase to 55 miles per hour, still cautious, but making better time. At 12:41 in the morning, James rounded a sweeping left-hand curve, and his headlights illuminated the road ahead. His blood turned to ice. Standing on the shoulder exactly as before was the woman in the wedding dress. Same white gown, same extended arm, same dead, expressionless face. It was impossible. There was no way the woman could have traveled 31 miles in 42 minutes. James had been driving at an average speed of 45 miles per hour through difficult terrain. For the woman to be here now, she would have had to average more than 40 miles per hour on foot through mountainous wilderness in dense fog. It was physically impossible. Yet there she stood, as real and solid as the pavement beneath his tires. James felt panic rising in his chest. His mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe it was a different woman. Maybe there was a wedding party or some kind of event he didn't know about, and multiple women in wedding dresses were scattered along Route 50 for some reason. But even as he thought this, James knew it wasn't true. The dress was identical, with the same dark stains in the same locations. The woman's posture and appearance were exactly the same as before. This was the same woman, or something that looked exactly like her. James's truck approached the woman, and once again he had the opportunity to stop. Part of him wanted to brake, to roll down his window and ask what was happening, to demand an explanation for this impossibility. But a deeper, more primitive part of his brain was screaming danger, warning him that stopping would be a fatal mistake. James trusted his instincts and kept his foot on the accelerator. As his truck passed the woman, he stared at her through his passenger side window. She was perhaps 15 feet away, clearly visible in the glow of his running lights. Her eyes followed his truck as he passed, and James saw that they weren't hollow shadows, as he had initially thought. They were eyes, but they were wrong. They were too dark, too deep, as if they were windows into infinite emptiness. The woman's skin was not just pale, but had a translucent quality, and James could see dark veins beneath the surface like cracks in marble. Her lips were grey, the color of a corpse days past death, and her expression, which James had interpreted as blank, was actually something worse. It was hunger. The woman was looking at James's truck with naked, desperate hunger. James accelerated, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. He watched his mirrors as the woman receded into the darkness behind him, her arms still extended, still waiting for someone to stop. The moment she disappeared from view, James grabbed his CB microphone again. "This is Midnight Express on Route 50 eastbound. I need someone to respond. I'm seeing something that doesn't make sense, and I need confirmation from another driver. Is anyone out there?" The radio crackled and popped, but no voice emerged from the noise. James tried his cell phone, thinking he could call dispatch or 911, but when he looked at the screen, he saw there was no signal. The mountains blocked most cell coverage, and Route 50 passed through so many dead zones that reliable phone communication was impossible. James was completely alone, isolated in his truck with no way to contact anyone and no way to make sense of what he was seeing. He considered turning around, heading back to Charleston, and refusing to complete the delivery. But turning a 53-foot semi-truck around on a narrow mountain highway was dangerous under the best conditions, and in fog, it would be nearly suicidal. Besides, James told himself, he was more than halfway to Cumberland. The smart thing to do was keep moving forward, deliver the load, and never accept another run on Route 50 again. He increased his speed to 60 miles per hour, pushing the limits of safety in the fog, but desperate to cover ground as quickly as possible. For the next 37 minutes, James drove without incident. The fog continued to thin, and by 1:20 in the morning, visibility had improved dramatically. James could see nearly a mile ahead, and the moon had emerged from behind the clouds, bathing the landscape in silver light. The highway followed a broad valley between two mountain ridges, and James could see farms and scattered houses with their porch lights glowing warmly in the night. The sight of civilization, even sparse rural development, was comforting. James began to relax slightly, telling himself that the worst was over. He had seen something strange, something he couldn't explain, but he was past it now and approaching the more populated areas around Clarksburg. In a few hours, this would all be behind him, just another strange story to tell other drivers over coffee at a truck stop. But even as he tried to convince himself of this, James knew that something fundamental had changed tonight. He had glimpsed something that existed outside the normal rules of reality, something that inhabited the dark spaces between towns and preyed on travelers who ventured too far into the wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains had been home to strange legends for centuries, stories of witches and ghosts and creatures that defied classification. James had always dismissed such tales as folklore, the kind of superstitions that appealed to tourists but had no basis in reality. Now he wasn't so sure. At 1:28 in the morning, James crested a rise and began descending toward the town of Clarksburg, visible in the distance as a cluster of lights in the valley below. The highway here was a straight downgrade, a 2-mile stretch of road with perfect visibility and no curves. James could see all the way to the bottom of the hill, could see the lights of Clarksburg growing brighter as he descended. There was nothing on the road ahead of him, no obstacles, no vehicles, no pedestrians. The highway was completely empty and clear. James relaxed his grip on the steering wheel and allowed himself a small sigh of relief. Whatever he had encountered, it seemed to be limited to the more remote sections of the highway. Once he reached Clarksburg, he would stop at the first open gas station, make some phone calls, and decide how to proceed. But then, impossibly, she appeared. One moment the road ahead was empty. The next moment, without any transition or movement, the woman in the wedding dress was standing on the shoulder. Not walking up to the road, not emerging from the woods, just suddenly present, as if she had materialized from thin air. James shouted in shock and fear, his hands jerking the steering wheel reflexively before he regained control. His truck swerved slightly, but stayed in its lane. James's eyes were locked on the woman as he approached her for the third time. She stood in the same posture, arm extended, face turned toward his truck. But now James could see something new. The woman was holding something in her other hand, something that dangled at her side. As his headlights illuminated her more clearly, James saw that it was a bouquet of flowers. Dead flowers, brown and withered, held in a skeletal grip. The woman's wedding dress, seen clearly in the bright moonlight, was not just stained but torn, with rips and holes that revealed more of that translucent, corpse-pale skin beneath. James drove past the woman for the third time, and as he did so, he made a decision. He was not going to stop in Clarksburg. Whatever was happening tonight, whatever this woman or apparition or hallucination was, James had a feeling that stopping would be exactly the wrong thing to do. The old CB radio warning echoed in his memory. "Be careful, she's out tonight. The bride is walking." Someone had tried to warn him. Someone who knew about this phenomenon. Which meant James wasn't the first driver to encounter the woman in white. And if others had encountered her before, where were they now? Why hadn't James heard stories about this in all his years driving Route 50? The answer that came to him was chilling. Maybe the drivers who stopped to help the bride never made it back to tell their stories. James pressed down on the accelerator, pushing his truck to 65 miles per hour as he reached the outskirts of Clarksburg. The town was larger than he had expected, with several thousand residents and a proper main street lined with shops and restaurants. But at 1:30 in the morning on a Tuesday night, everything was closed. The streets were deserted, the buildings dark. James's truck was the only vehicle moving through town, his diesel engine the only sound breaking the mountain silence. He didn't stop at the gas station or the convenience store. He kept driving, following Route 50 as it curved through the center of town, and then climbed back into the mountains on the eastern side. As James left Clarksburg behind, he tried to analyze what was happening with the rational, methodical approach that had served him well throughout his driving career. He made a mental list of facts. Fact 1, he had now seen the same woman 3 times in 3 different locations spanning approximately 60 miles of highway. Fact 2, the time intervals between sightings were decreasing. 42 minutes between the first and second, 47 minutes between the second and third. Fact 3, the woman appeared to be dead or undead, with physical characteristics that suggested a corpse rather than a living person. Fact 4, The woman had materialized on an empty stretch of road with no possible way she could have walked or driven to that location. Fact 5. Someone else knew about this phenomenon and had tried to warn other drivers over the CB radio. James considered the possibility that he was experiencing some kind of mental breakdown, that stress and exhaustion had caused him to hallucinate, but he didn't feel tired or impaired. His mind was crystal clear, sharpened by adrenaline and fear. Everything else about the drive was normal. His truck was running perfectly. The road conditions were good now that the fog had lifted, and all his sensory perceptions seemed accurate. He wasn't imagining the mile markers or the towns or the mountains. Why would he imagine only the woman? James tried the CB radio again, cycling through different channels and calling out repeatedly. On channel 19, which most truckers monitored, he heard nothing. But on channel 9, traditionally reserved for emergencies, James heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a voice, or multiple voices, speaking over each other in a chaotic jumble. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, panic, desperation. James caught fragments. Can't stop. She's getting closer. I don't know what to... The voices faded in and out, sometimes clear and sometimes buried in static. James recognized the phenomenon. He was hearing skip, distant radio transmissions bouncing off the ionosphere and traveling hundreds or even thousands of miles. These weren't local drivers. These were voices from the past, recordings somehow trapped in the radio waves, or perhaps souls crying out from wherever they had ended up after encountering the bride. James switched the radio off. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the rumble of his engine and the hiss of his tires on wet pavement. Rain had begun to fall, light drops that sparkled in his headlights. The windshield wipers engaged automatically, sweeping across the glass in a steady rhythm. James checked his GPS and saw that he was making good progress despite everything. He had covered nearly 100 miles and had approximately 110 miles remaining to Cumberland. At his current speed, he would arrive around 3:30 in the morning, well ahead of his 8 o'clock delivery window. For the next hour, James drove without seeing the bride. The rain intensified, becoming a steady downpour that reduced visibility and forced him to slow to 50 miles per hour. The highway climbed back into the mountains, following a series of switchbacks that required James's full attention. He navigated the curves with practiced skill, his truck's headlights sweeping across walls of wet rock on one side and empty air on the other. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the landscape in stark white light. James was grateful for the distraction of difficult driving conditions. Focusing on the technical challenges of handling a heavy truck in rain kept his mind occupied and prevented him from dwelling too much on what he had seen. But in the back of his mind, he was counting down the minutes. If the pattern held, if the time intervals between appearances continued to decrease, he should see the bride again soon, very soon. At 2:47 in the morning, James rounded a hairpin turn, and his headlights fell upon a bridge. It was an old stone arch bridge, probably dating back 100 years or more, spanning a deep gorge. A sign before the bridge indicated the structure was weight restricted and recommended speed was 25 miles per hour. James downshifted and slowed his truck, approaching the bridge cautiously. The narrow span was barely wide enough for his truck, with perhaps 6 inches of clearance on each side. James could hear the roar of water far below, a mountain stream swollen by the rain. Halfway across the bridge, standing directly in James's lane, with both hands raised above her head and that dead bouquet held high, was the bride. James had perhaps 3 seconds to react. Slamming on the brakes at this speed on the wet bridge surface would cause his truck to jackknife and potentially crash through the low stone walls into the gorge below. Swerving to avoid the woman would have the same result. James's only option was to maintain his speed and drive straight through her. He gripped the steering wheel and held his course, his eyes locked on the woman as his truck bore down on her. The bride didn't move. She stood with arms raised, wedding dress soaked by rain and clinging to her skeletal frame, face tilted up toward James's windshield. Her mouth was open now, and James could see that she was screaming, though no sound penetrated the cab of his truck. Her eyes, those deep, dark, endless eyes, were fixed on James with an intensity that felt like physical contact. At the last possible second before impact, the woman's image flickered, becoming translucent like smoke. James's truck passed through the space where she had been standing, and for just an instant, the temperature inside his cab dropped 40 degrees. Frost formed on the inside of his windshield, and his breath came out in visible clouds. Then the moment passed, the cab temperature returned to normal, and James was across the bridge and accelerating away into the rainy night. James's hands were shaking so badly that he had difficulty maintaining control of the truck. He pulled into a small roadside overlook approximately 2 miles past the bridge and put the truck in neutral, engaging the parking brake. For several minutes he just sat there, breathing deeply and trying to calm his racing heart. The rain drummed on the roof of his cab, and the windshield wipers continued their rhythmic sweeping. James looked at the clock on his dashboard, 2:53 in the morning. He had driven through the bride. Actually driven through her, proving beyond any doubt that she was not a physical being, but something else entirely. A ghost, James supposed, though the word felt inadequate to describe what he had witnessed. Ghosts were supposed to be transparent, ethereal things that floated and moaned. This bride was something far more substantial and far more terrifying. She appeared real and solid until the moment of contact, and even then, her presence had been powerful enough to freeze the air inside his truck. James wondered how many drivers over the years had actually stopped when the bride flagged them down. How many men had opened their passenger door to let her climb in, thinking they were helping a woman in distress? And what happened to those men once the bride was inside their vehicle with them? James didn't want to think about it, but his imagination supplied images anyway. He pictured truck cabs found abandoned on lonely stretches of Route 50, engines still running but no sign of the drivers. He pictured police investigations that went nowhere, missing person cases that were never solved. He pictured families grieving for fathers and husbands who had simply vanished into the night, leaving no clue about their fate. How many times had this played out? How many victims had the bride claimed over the decades or centuries she had been haunting this highway? James grabbed his phone and checked for signal. Still nothing. He was in a complete dead zone, cut off from any outside communication. His truck's radio wouldn't work for making phone calls, even if he could get a signal. It was strictly a CB radio system. James considered his options. He could wait here until daylight, hoping that the bride only appeared at night. But sunrise was still 4 hours away, and James didn't think he could endure sitting still for that long, waiting and wondering if the bride would appear at his window. The alternative was to keep driving and hope he could make it to Cumberland before encountering her again. Based on the pattern of appearances, James calculated that he might have as little as 30 or 40 minutes before the next sighting. If he pushed his truck to its limit and drove as fast as safely possible, he might be able to stay ahead of her. James released the parking brake and shifted back into gear. He pulled out of the overlook and back onto Route 50, accelerating to 65 miles per hour, despite the rain and the dangerous road conditions. His truck's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing twisting mountain highway that seemed to go on forever. James forced himself to focus on driving, on watching the road, and managing his speed through curves and over hills. He couldn't afford to think about the bride or what she represented. He had to treat this like any other delivery, just a job that needed to be completed professionally and safely. But his eyes kept flicking to his mirrors, searching the darkness behind him for any sign of white dress or extended arm. The rain began to ease around 3:15, and by 3:25 it had stopped completely. The clouds started to break up, revealing patches of stars between their edges. A 3/4 moon emerged, bright enough to cast shadows across the landscape. James passed through 2 small towns, barely more than crossroads with a few houses and a general store. Both were completely dark and deserted. The highway began to descend from the highest elevations of the Appalachian Range, following a long, gradual slope toward the eastern lowlands. James could see far ahead now, the road visible for miles as it snaked through the valleys below. At 3:41 in the morning, exactly 48 minutes after the bridge encounter, James saw something that made him question his sanity. In the moonlight, perhaps half a mile ahead, he could see a figure walking in the center of the highway. Not standing and waiting, but actually walking, moving slowly eastward in the same direction James was traveling. As his truck drew closer, James could make out more details. It was the bride, of course. She was walking barefoot down the yellow center line, her wedding dress trailing behind her, her head bowed as if in deep sorrow. The dead flowers were gone, and her arms hung at her sides. She moved with a strange gliding motion that didn't quite match normal human locomotion. James slowed his truck, uncertain what to do. If he continued at his current speed, he would overtake the walking bride in approximately 60 seconds. If he slowed to match her pace, he would be following her down the highway indefinitely. Neither option was appealing, but James chose the former. He maintained his speed and approached the walking figure, his heart pounding in anticipation of another supernatural encounter. As he drew close, James could see details he had missed in previous sightings. The bride's feet left no mark on the wet pavement. No footprints, no disturbance of the water pooled on the road's surface. She simply glided forward, disconnected from the physical world. James's truck was approximately 100 feet behind the bride when she stopped walking. She stood motionless in the center of the road for perhaps 5 seconds. Then, slowly, she turned around to face the approaching truck. Her head tilted back, and James saw her mouth open wide, far wider than any human jaw should be able to open. Her face contorted into an expression of such rage and hunger that James felt his bladder weaken. The bride raised both arms toward the truck, fingers splayed and grasping, as if she could reach across the 100 feet separating them and pull James from his cab. James didn't slow down. He aimed his truck straight at the figure and closed the distance rapidly. Once again, he drove directly through her, and once again the temperature inside his cab plummeted. But this time, something else happened. As the bride's form passed through his windshield, James heard a voice, not a sound transmitted through air, but a voice that spoke directly into his mind. It said a single word, drawn out and filled with anguish. "Stop!" The voice was female, young, desperate. It carried layers of emotion, pain, and longing, and an emptiness so profound that James felt tears spring to his eyes. Then it was over, and James was past her, accelerating away into the night with frost melting on his windshield and the echo of that voice still reverberating in his skull. James drove for 15 more minutes in a state of shock, his mind replaying that voice over and over. Stop! What did it mean? Was the bride asking him to stop and help her, or warning him to stop before something worse happened? Or perhaps commanding him to stop, using some supernatural compulsion that hadn't quite worked? James didn't know, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. His GPS showed that he was within 30 miles of the Maryland border. Once he crossed into Maryland, he would be out of West Virginia and off Route 50. The road continued on the other side of the border, but James had a superstitious hope that whatever haunted the West Virginia portion of the highway might not follow him across the state line. It wasn't a rational thought, but nothing about tonight had been rational. At 3:59 in the morning, James crested a hill and saw something unexpected in the valley below. A town. Not a small crossroads hamlet, but an actual town with dozens of buildings and multiple streetlights illuminating what looked like a Main Street commercial district. James checked his GPS, but the device showed no town in this location. According to the satellite map, he was driving through uninhabited national forest land with no development of any kind for another 20 miles. Yet, there it was, spread out before him as real as anything he had ever seen. James considered driving through without stopping, but his fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank remaining, and his nerves were frayed to the breaking point. If this town had a gas station, and if the gas station was open, James decided he would stop and refuel. More importantly, he would try to find anyone who could tell him what was happening on Route 50 tonight. James slowed his truck as he entered the town, looking for street signs that might identify the location. The first sign he saw read, "Welcome to Prosperity, West Virginia, population 875, founded 1798. James tried to remember if he had ever heard of Prosperity before, but the name meant nothing to him. The town looked old, with brick buildings that could date back to the 19th century and a distinctly historical character to the architecture. But everything was in perfect repair, freshly painted and well-maintained. Streetlights burned brightly, illuminating storefronts and sidewalks. Yet as James drove slowly down Main Street, he realized something was wrong. There were no people. Not a single person was visible anywhere. No cars were parked on the street. No lights were on in any of the buildings. The town looked occupied and maintained, but completely deserted. James saw a gas station ahead, a vintage-looking structure with old-fashioned pumps under a peaked roof. The station's lights were on, and the open sign was illuminated in the window. James pulled his truck into the parking lot and positioned it beside the pumps. He shut off his engine and sat for a moment, listening to the sudden silence. The ticking of cooling metal was the only sound. James took a deep breath and opened his door, stepping down from the cab into the chilly pre-dawn air. His boots hit the pavement with a solid sound that echoed off the surrounding buildings. James walked to the gas pumps and examined them. They were old but functional, with mechanical displays rather than digital readouts. A handwritten sign taped to one pump read, "Pay inside, self-serve available." James looked toward the station building and saw that the interior lights were on, but he couldn't see anyone through the windows. He walked to the door and tried the handle. It opened easily, and a bell chimed as James stepped inside. The interior of the gas station was like stepping back in time 50 years. Wood plank floors, shelves stocked with products in vintage packaging, a cash register that was mechanical rather than electronic. Behind the counter was a display of cigarettes, and James recognized brand names that had been discontinued decades ago. A calendar on the wall showed October 1953. James called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" His voice sounded too loud in the empty space. No answer came. James walked around the store, checking the aisles and the back room. The station was completely deserted, but showed every sign of recent occupancy. A coffee pot on the counter still contained hot coffee, its aroma filling the air. A sandwich sat half-eaten on a plate beside the cash register, fresh enough that the bread hadn't dried out. Someone had been here moments before James arrived, but they had vanished without a trace. James felt the hair on the back of his neck standing up. This was wrong in a completely different way than the bride was wrong. The bride was obviously supernatural, obviously a ghost or spirit or something beyond normal reality. But this town, this gas station, felt real and solid and normal, yet was utterly impossible. James returned to his truck and looked at the fuel pumps. His gauge showed he desperately needed to refuel, but the thought of using gas from this impossible place made him uneasy. What if the fuel was as unreal as everything else? What if it disappeared when he left town, leaving him stranded? But his other option was to drive on with insufficient fuel and risk running out on some remote mountain road. James made his decision. He grabbed the pump nozzle and began filling his tank, watching the mechanical numbers spin as gallons were dispensed. The fuel flowed normally, and the tank filled in approximately 8 minutes. James replaced the nozzle and looked at the pump display. It showed he owed $147. James walked back to the station door and opened it, calling inside. "I'm leaving money on the counter for the gas, $150. He pulled his wallet from his pocket, extracted the bills, and placed them on the counter beside the half-eaten sandwich. As he turned to leave, James noticed something he had missed before. A newspaper lay folded on a chair near the door. The masthead read Prosperity Times, and the date was October 23rd, 1953. James picked up the paper and scanned the front page. The main headline read, "Local bride still missing after week-long search." Below was a photograph of a young woman in a wedding dress, smiling at the camera. James felt his stomach twist as he recognized the face. It was her, the bride from the highway. She looked alive and happy in the photograph, but the caption confirmed James's worst fears. Martha Elizabeth Crane, age 23, disappeared on October 16th while traveling to her wedding ceremony in Cumberland, Maryland. Miss Crane was last seen leaving her parents' home in Prosperity at 6 o'clock in the evening. Her car was found abandoned on Route 50, approximately 15 miles east of town, with no sign of Miss Crane or any indication of what became of her. James stood frozen in the empty gas station, the newspaper clutched in his hands, staring at the photograph of Martha Crane. The woman who had been appearing to him repeatedly throughout the night was real, or had been real 70 years ago. She had been a living person with a name and a family and a future that had been stolen from her on an October night 7 decades in the past. James forced himself to read the entire article, learning the details of Martha's disappearance. She had been engaged to a man named Thomas Whitmore, a schoolteacher in Cumberland. The wedding was scheduled for October 17th, 1953. Martha had planned to drive to Cumberland on the evening of October 16th to stay with her future mother-in-law and prepare for the ceremony. She left her parents' house in Prosperity at 6 o'clock, driving a 1948 Ford sedan that had been a gift from her fiancé. The drive should have taken approximately 3 hours, putting her in Cumberland by 9 o'clock, but Martha never arrived. When she failed to appear by midnight, Thomas called Martha's parents in Prosperity, who confirmed she had left as planned. A search was organized immediately, and by dawn on October 17th, searchers had found Martha's car abandoned on Route 50 near mile marker 153. The article described the condition of the car. It had been parked on the shoulder of the road with the engine still running and the driver's door standing open. Martha's purse was on the front seat, her wedding dress hanging in the back seat wrapped in protective cloth. Nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed. It was as if Martha had simply stepped out of the car and vanished into the mountain night. The search continued for weeks, with hundreds of volunteers combing the woods and ravines along Route 50 for any trace of the missing bride. Bloodhounds tracked her scent from the car approximately 200 yards into the forest, then lost the trail at the edge of a steep cliff overlooking a river gorge. Some searchers believed Martha had fallen over the cliff, but no body was ever recovered from the gorge, despite extensive efforts. Others speculated that she had been abducted, though there was no evidence of a struggle or any witnesses who had seen another vehicle in the area. Thomas Whitmore offered a reward of $5,000, an enormous sum in 1953, for information leading to Martha's recovery. Despite the substantial reward and the massive search effort, no trace of Martha Elizabeth Crane was ever found. The case remained open and unsolved, one of West Virginia's enduring mysteries. James set the newspaper back on the chair and walked slowly out of the gas station. His mind was reeling with this new information. Martha Crane had disappeared 70 years ago, somewhere along Route 50 between Prosperity and Cumberland. And now her ghost, still wearing the wedding dress she never got to wear to her ceremony, still holding the dead bouquet she never got to carry down the aisle, was appearing to drivers on the same highway where she vanished. James understood now why she was trying to flag down vehicles. She was still trying to get to Cumberland, still trying to reach her wedding that was supposed to happen 7 decades ago. Martha didn't know she was dead, or maybe she knew but couldn't accept it, couldn't move on from the single purpose that had been driving her on the night she disappeared. She needed someone to stop, someone to give her a ride, someone to help her complete the journey she had started in 1953. But something about the way she appeared, something about the hunger and desperation James had seen in her face, told him that accepting Martha as a passenger would be a fatal mistake. The drivers who had stopped for her over the years, the men who had opened their doors and offered help, had shared Martha's fate, They had disappeared just as completely as she had, pulled into whatever dark space existed between life and death where Martha's spirit was trapped. James climbed back into his truck and started the engine. He needed to leave this impossible town, needed to get back on Route 50 and finish his drive to Cumberland. As he pulled out of the gas station and drove back onto Main Street, James looked carefully at the buildings around him. In the growing pre-dawn light, he could see more details. Every building was period-appropriate for the 1950s. There were no satellite dishes, no modern vehicles, no contemporary signage. It was as if the entire town was frozen in time, existing in an eternal October 1953. James passed the town limits and returned to the darkness of Route 50. As he drove away, he checked his rear-view mirrors and watched the lights of prosperity recede into the distance. But after perhaps half a mile, James glanced in his mirror again and saw nothing but darkness behind him. The town had vanished. James stopped his truck in the middle of the empty highway and turned around in his seat, staring back the way he had come. There were no lights visible, no sign that any town existed in that direction. James checked his GPS again. It still showed uninhabited forest, no town, no buildings, no gas station. James looked at his fuel gauge. It read full. The tank that had been nearly empty was now full, evidence that his stop in prosperity had been real, even if the town itself had been some kind of temporal anomaly or ghostly recreation of the past. James turned back around and continued driving east. The sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn, turning from black to dark blue to grey. James estimated he had perhaps 45 minutes of darkness remaining, and he hoped desperately that Martha only appeared at night. If he could just make it to sunrise, if he could just reach the Maryland border before encountering her again, maybe he would be safe. The highway climbed toward the final mountain pass before the descent into Maryland. James pushed his truck as fast as he dared, maintaining 65 miles per hour on the winding road. At 4:37 in the morning, with the eastern sky showing the first hints of orange and pink from the coming sunrise, James crested the highest point of the pass and began the long descent toward the state border. He could see for miles ahead, the highway snaking down through forested slopes toward the valleys of western Maryland. And standing at the very top of the pass, silhouetted against the dawn sky directly in the center of the road, was Martha Crane. She wasn't alone. 5 other figures stood with her, all wearing white, all with their arms extended toward James's truck. Martha had brought her victims with her, the drivers who had stopped to help over the years and had paid with their lives. They stood together like a wedding party from hell, waiting to claim one more soul before the sun rose and banished them back to whatever dimension they inhabited during daylight hours. James had approximately 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. The cluster of figures blocked the road completely, leaving no room to swerve around them. James's options were limited to 3 choices. He could brake and stop before reaching the ghosts, which would leave him stranded at the summit with no way forward. He could attempt to turn around and flee back down the mountain, abandoning his delivery and his route. Or he could do what he had done 4 times already tonight, drive straight through them and hope he survived the experience. James chose the third option. He pressed down on the accelerator and aimed his truck directly at the center of the ghostly gathering. As his speed increased to 70 miles per hour, James could see more details of the figures arrayed before him. Martha stood in the center, her wedding dress even more tattered than before, her face tilted up toward James's windshield with that same expression of desperate hunger. On either side of her stood the men she had claimed, 5 drivers still wearing the clothes they had died in, their faces showing the decay of years or decades spent in her spectral company. James recognized the clothing styles from different eras. One man wore a suit and fedora from the 1960s. Another wore bell-bottom jeans and a denim jacket from the 70s. The most recent addition wore modern clothes from perhaps 10 years ago, his face still showing enough detail that James could make out his anguished expression. At the last possible moment before impact, all 6 figures raised their arms and stepped forward as if to meet James's truck. Martha's mouth opened in that impossibly wide scream, and James heard her voice again, louder and more desperate than before. "Stop, please! I need to get to my wedding. I can't be late. Please stop and help me." The other 5 voices joined hers in a chorus of pleading and command. "Stop for her! Stop for us! Stop and join us! You must stop!" James gritted his teeth and held his course. His truck hit the cluster of spirits at 70 miles per hour. The temperature inside the cab dropped so fast that the windows cracked from thermal shock. Frost covered every surface instantly. James's breath came out in clouds of vapor so thick he could barely see. The voices surrounded him, seeming to come from everywhere at once, screaming and pleading and demanding. Ghostly hands pressed against the windows from the outside, leaving handprints in the frost. James felt an overwhelming urge to stop the truck, to put it in neutral and open his door, to invite Martha into his cab and offer her the ride she so desperately wanted. The compulsion was nearly irresistible, a psychic pressure that made his foot begin to lift off the accelerator toward the brake pedal. But James remembered Thomas Whitmore, the schoolteacher who had waited for his bride in Cumberland 70 years ago. He remembered the search parties and the grieving parents and the life that Martha had lost. And he remembered the 5 men whose faces he had seen, men who had stopped to help and had paid with everything. Whatever Martha had become in her 70 years of haunting Route 50, she was no longer the innocent young woman from prosperity. She was a predator, a supernatural trap that lured in victims with the appearance of needing help. James fought against the compulsion and kept his truck moving forward. The voices grew louder, more angry, shrieking with rage at his resistance. The temperature continued to plummet, and James realized with horror that his windows were beginning to freeze from the inside out, thick ice forming that obscured his view of the road. He was blind again, driving at 70 miles per hour on a mountain highway, while completely unable to see where he was going. James slammed his fist against the driver's side window, trying to break the ice, but it was too thick and too cold. He fumbled for the defroster controls, cranking them to maximum heat, but the truck's heater was no match for the supernatural cold filling his cab. James could feel his fingers going numb, his body temperature dropping dangerously. If he stayed in this frozen environment much longer, he would die of hypothermia. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The voices cut off in mid-scream. The temperature shot back up to normal so fast that James felt dizzy from the transition. The ice on his windows melted instantly, running down the glass in rivulets of water, and the morning sun broke over the eastern horizon ahead, flooding the highway with golden light. James could see again, and what he saw was an empty road descending toward the Maryland border. No ghosts, no wedding party from hell, just pavement and guardrails and forest. James had made it through. He had survived the night on Route 50 and had escaped the bride's trap. James drove for another 10 minutes before his hands stopped shaking enough that he trusted himself to pull over. He found a scenic overlook and parked his truck, then sat with his head in his hands, breathing deeply and trying to process what he had experienced. The sun was fully up now, bright and warm and gloriously normal. Traffic began to appear on the highway, morning commuters heading to work in Cumberland and the surrounding towns. Everything looked safe and ordinary in the daylight. James checked his phone and saw that he had a signal again. 7 missed calls from dispatch, 3 voicemail messages. James listened to the messages. They were all from Linda, asking where he was and whether everything was okay with the delivery. James checked the time and saw it was 5:23 in the morning. He was still 2 hours early for his 8 o'clock delivery window. James called Linda back, and she answered immediately. "James, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours." James opened his mouth to tell her everything that had happened, but stopped himself. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he describe Martha Crane and the impossible town of Prosperity and the ghosts at the summit? Linda would think he had lost his mind. Hell, James wasn't entirely sure he hadn't lost his mind. Instead, he said simply, "Cell service was terrible through the mountains. I lost signal for most of the drive, but I'm fine, and I'm about 40 minutes from the delivery site." Linda seemed satisfied with this explanation and told him to call again once the delivery was complete. James ended the call and started his truck. He pulled back onto Route 50 and continued toward Cumberland, watching the landscape transform from mountainous wilderness to rolling farmland as he crossed into Maryland. The highway here was wider, better maintained, with frequent signs of civilization. James passed shopping centers and housing developments and all the comforting infrastructure of modern America. The contrast with the isolated, haunted stretches of Route 50 in West Virginia couldn't have been more dramatic. James completed his delivery at 7:45, unloading the machinery parts at a manufacturing plant on the outskirts of Cumberland. The dock workers were friendly and efficient, and within an hour James was free to deadhead back to Charleston. But he didn't take Route 50. James spent his federally mandated 10-hour rest period in a Cumberland motel, sleeping fitfully and dreaming of white dresses and dead flowers. When he woke at 6 in the evening, he made a decision. He needed to know more about Martha Crane and what had happened to her in October 1953. The newspaper article from the ghost town of Prosperity had provided basic facts, but James wanted deeper answers. If he was going to process what he had experienced, if he was going to make sense of his encounter with the supernatural, he needed to understand the history behind the haunting. James found a local library that was open until 9 o'clock and spent 3 hours researching. The Cumberland Library had an extensive collection of regional newspapers on microfilm, and James located multiple articles about Martha Crane's disappearance from autumn 1953. He read every story, taking notes on the details. The picture that emerged was both sad and disturbing. Martha had been a popular young woman in Prosperity, well liked by everyone who knew her. She taught Sunday school at the local Methodist church and worked as a secretary at the town hall. Her engagement to Thomas Whitmore had been announced in June, and the October wedding date had been set to coincide with the peak of fall foliage in the mountains. On the day of her disappearance, Martha had been excited and happy according to everyone who saw her. She left her parents' house right on schedule at 6 o'clock, waving goodbye as she drove away in her 1948 Ford sedan. Multiple people in Prosperity saw her car heading east on Route 50, confirming she had at least made it out of town. The last confirmed sighting was at a gas station about 10 miles east of Prosperity, where Martha stopped to fill her tank and used the restroom at approximately 6:30. The attendant remembered her because she was so cheerful, chatting about her upcoming wedding and how excited she was to start her new life in Cumberland. Martha left the gas station at 6:45 and was never seen alive again. Her car was found 3 hours later at mile marker 153, approximately 35 miles from the gas station and still 60 miles short of Cumberland. The timeline suggested she had driven for perhaps an hour after leaving the gas station, then stopped or been forced to stop for unknown reasons. What happened during that hour remained a complete mystery. There were no other cars found near Martha's vehicle, no witnesses who reported seeing anything unusual, no evidence of an accident or mechanical failure. The car was in perfect working order when police examined it, with plenty of fuel and the ignition still engaged. James found multiple follow-up articles from late 1953 and early 1954, documenting the continued search efforts and the growing mystery surrounding Martha's fate. Several articles mentioned Thomas Whitmore's grief and his refusal to accept that Martha might be dead. Thomas posted flyers, hired private investigators, and even contacted psychics in his desperate attempt to find his missing fiancée. But as months passed with no new leads, the investigation gradually lost momentum. By spring of 1954, the newspapers had moved on to other stories, and Martha Crane became just another unsolved disappearance in West Virginia's long history of people who vanished in the mountains. James discovered one final article from August 1954 that made him pause. It was Thomas Whitmore's obituary. The school teacher had died at age 30, just 10 months after Martha's disappearance. The cause of death was listed as suicide. Thomas had driven to the exact spot where Martha's car had been found on Route 50 and taken his own life with a pistol. The article mentioned that Thomas left a note saying he couldn't live without Martha and that he hoped to find her in whatever realm she had gone to. James sat back in his chair, feeling a deep sadness for the tragedy that had unfolded 70 years ago. 2 young lives destroyed, families left grieving, a future stolen by whatever dark force inhabited Route 50 that October night. James spent the next week back in Charleston, running local deliveries and trying to return to normal life. But he couldn't stop thinking about Martha Crane and the other drivers whose faces he had seen at the mountain summit. James made discreet inquiries among the veteran truckers at the Charleston truck stops, asking if anyone had heard stories about Route 50 being haunted or dangerous. Most drivers dismissed his questions with jokes about how all mountain highways were dangerous if you weren't careful, but a few older drivers gave him knowing looks and quiet warnings. One driver in particular, a man named Earl Patterson, who had been running routes through West Virginia for 40 years, pulled James aside one evening. Earl was in his late 60s, with the weathered face and slow, deliberate speech of someone who had seen more than he cared to remember. He told James that Route 50 had claimed more than its share of victims over the decades, though most of them were attributed to accidents or driver error. Earl himself had driven Route 50 hundreds of times and had never seen anything supernatural, but he knew 4 drivers personally who had disappeared on that highway under mysterious circumstances, their trucks found abandoned with no sign of the men who had been driving them. Earl described one case from 1987. A driver named Michael Chen had been hauling furniture from Charleston to Cumberland when he vanished somewhere along Route 50. Michael's truck was found parked on the shoulder near mile marker 161, engine running, headlights on, driver's door hanging open. Michael's wallet, phone, and personal belongings were all in the cab. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of a struggle, no indication of where Michael had gone or why he had stopped. State police searched the area extensively, but found nothing. Michael Chen was never seen again, and his case remained officially unsolved. Earl mentioned 3 other similar disappearances spanning from 1973 to 2009, all following the same pattern. Trucks found running but abandoned, drivers vanished without a trace, searches yielding no clues. None of the official reports mentioned ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but Earl said the trucking community had its own theories. There was something on Route 50 that took people, something that appeared innocent or in need of help, something that lured drivers into stopping. And once they stopped, once they opened their doors and let it in, they were never seen again. Earl looked James in the eye and said simply, "If you're smart, you'll never run that highway again. There are plenty of other routes to Cumberland." James took Earl's advice to heart. He informed dispatch that he would no longer accept loads that required travel on Route 50 through West Virginia. Linda was puzzled by this sudden restriction, since Route 50 had always been one of James's preferred routes, but she accommodated his request. For the next 3 months, James successfully avoided Route 50, taking longer alternative routes through Pennsylvania or Virginia whenever he had deliveries to the eastern part of the state. But the memories of that November night haunted him. James had nightmares about Martha Crane several times a week, dreaming of her standing in the road with arms extended, her voice calling out to him. He often woke in the middle of the night, convinced he could hear her pleading, "Stop, please, I can't be late." James began researching ghost bride legends from across America and discovered that Martha's story fit a common pattern. Many highways, particularly rural mountain roads, had legends of hitchhiking ghosts who appeared to drivers at night. Most of these legends involved women, often young brides or prom dates who had died in car accidents or been victims of violence. Some researchers theorized that these ghosts were simply folklore, stories that spread through communities and took on lives of their own. Others believed they represented actual paranormal phenomena, spirits trapped between worlds who repeatedly tried to complete journeys interrupted by death. James found accounts from drivers in Colorado, Montana, Texas, and Virginia who described encounters remarkably similar to his own experience. In every case, the ghost appeared multiple times during a single journey, showing up in locations that should have been impossible to reach. In most cases, drivers who stopped to help the ghost disappeared permanently. James discovered online forums where truckers shared stories about haunted highways, and he created an anonymous account to post his own experience. Within days, he received messages from other drivers who had encountered the bride on Route 50. One driver from Ohio described seeing Martha 6 times in one night back in 2015, just as James had. The driver had made it to Cumberland safely, but never drove Route 50 again. Another driver from Pennsylvania reported encountering Martha twice in 2021 before deciding to turn around and take an alternate route, abandoning his delivery rather than risk a third encounter. Several drivers mentioned the town of Prosperity, describing how they had stopped there for gas, only to have the town vanish when they tried to find it again on a map. James realized that he was part of a much larger phenomenon, one that had been occurring for decades and affecting dozens or possibly hundreds of drivers. But why didn't this make the news? Why weren't there investigations or warnings or any official acknowledgement of the danger on Route 50? James theorized that the answer lay in how the disappearances were classified. Each vanishing was treated as an individual case with unique circumstances. Police looked for rational explanations. The driver had a personal crisis and walked away from his life. The driver was involved in criminal activity and fled. The driver had a medical emergency and wandered into the woods in a confused state. By treating each case separately, authorities never recognized the pattern. And without the pattern, there was no reason to suspect something supernatural was happening. The trucking companies and insurance agencies didn't want to publicize the disappearances because it would create liability issues and scare away drivers from an important route. So the truth remained hidden, known only to the drivers who had survived encounters with Martha and to the families of those who hadn't. James struggled with what to do with his knowledge. Part of him wanted to go public, to warn every driver in America about the danger on Route 50. But another part of him knew that no one would believe him without proof, and even if they did believe, what could anyone do? How do you stop a ghost that has been haunting a highway for 70 years? How do you help a spirit that is trapped in a loop of trying to reach a wedding that never happened, trying to complete a journey that was interrupted by death decades ago? 6 months after his encounter with Martha Crane, James received an unusual phone call. It was from a woman named Elizabeth Crane, who identified herself as Martha's great-niece. Elizabeth had been researching her family history and had come across James's anonymous online post about encountering a bride ghost on Route 50. Through careful analysis of the details James had shared, Elizabeth had determined that the ghost had to be her great-aunt Martha. She tracked down James through his trucking company and asked if they could meet to discuss what he had seen. James was initially reluctant, worried that talking about the experience would somehow make it more real or invite Martha back into his life. But Elizabeth was persistent, and eventually James agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in Charleston. Elizabeth turned out to be a woman in her early 30s, a history professor at a university in Pittsburgh who specialized in Appalachian folklore and ghost stories. She had grown up hearing family stories about the tragic disappearance of her great-aunt Martha, and when she began her research, she discovered that Martha's story had become a local legend in the Prosperity area. Elizabeth had collected over 20 accounts from drivers who claimed to have seen the ghost bride on Route 50. though most were second-hand stories or lacked specific details. James's account was the most detailed and credible she had found. Elizabeth told James something that made his blood run cold. According to family records and local historical documents, Martha had not simply disappeared on her way to Cumberland. Elizabeth had found evidence suggesting that Martha had been the victim of a serial predator who had been operating along Route 50 in the early 1950s. At least 6 other young women had vanished on Route 50 between 1948 and 1954, all under similar circumstances. Their cars were found abandoned on the shoulder of the road with no sign of the drivers. Police at the time had investigated the cases separately and never connected them, but Elizabeth's research had revealed the pattern. She believed a man, probably someone who lived along Route 50 and knew the isolated stretches where he could commit crimes without witnesses, had been stopping young female drivers by pretending to need help or by using some other ruse. Once he got them out of their cars, he abducted and likely murdered them. Martha Crane was one of his victims, and her body had probably been disposed of in one of the thousands of old mine shafts, abandoned wells, or deep ravines that dotted the mountains along Route 50. Elizabeth theorized that Martha's spirit was trapped in a loop, endlessly trying to reach her wedding, but also endlessly reliving the moment when she stopped her car to help someone she thought needed assistance. The ghost that drivers encountered was Martha's last hour of life, playing out over and over. Her innocent desire to help transformed into a supernatural trap that now endangered others. James asked Elizabeth the question that had been haunting him since that November night. How do we help her? How do we break the cycle and let Martha rest? Elizabeth admitted she didn't have an answer. She had consulted with paranormal investigators, spiritual advisors, and even a priest who specialized in helping restless spirits, but no one could offer a definitive solution. Some suggested that finding Martha's remains and giving her a proper burial might release her spirit. Others thought that if Thomas Whitmore's grave and Martha's grave could be united somehow, the two lovers might find peace together. Still others believed that Martha was beyond help, that she had become something darker than a simple ghost, something that fed on the fear and life force of her victims. Elizabeth had tried to organize searches for Martha's body along Route 50, but the sheer scope of the wilderness and the number of possible disposal sites made finding anything after 70 years nearly impossible. James listened to all of this and felt a deep sadness for Martha and for all the lives that had been destroyed by her tragedy. He also felt anger at the unknown killer who had never been caught or punished, whose crime had created this ongoing horror. As James prepared to leave the coffee shop, Elizabeth made one final request. She asked if James would be willing to drive Route 50 one more time, this time with her as a passenger and with equipment to document any paranormal activity. Elizabeth believed that with proper preparation and protections, they might be able to communicate with Martha's spirit and perhaps find a way to help her move on. James's first instinct was to refuse absolutely. The thought of deliberately encountering Martha again, of intentionally putting himself back in danger, went against every survival instinct he possessed. But Elizabeth argued that James was uniquely qualified for this task. He had survived multiple encounters with Martha, which suggested he had some kind of natural resistance or protection that most people lacked. He knew the pattern of her appearances and could anticipate where and when she would manifest. And most importantly, James had seen not just Martha, but also her victims, which meant he might be able to reach those trapped souls in a way that others couldn't. Elizabeth promised they would take every precaution, would have backup plans and emergency protocols, would involve paranormal experts who knew how to handle dangerous spirits. She appealed to James's sense of duty, pointing out that as long as Martha continued to haunt Route 50, more drivers would disappear. By refusing to help, James would be condemning future victims to the same fate that had befallen those 5 men he had seen at the summit. The argument worked. James agreed to make one more run on Route 50, but with conditions. They would do it in late November, around the anniversary of Martha's disappearance, when her presence was likely to be strongest. They would drive at night, recreating the conditions of James's original encounter, and they would go prepared with salt, iron, religious symbols, and whatever other protections the paranormal experts recommended. Over the next 4 months, James and Elizabeth prepared for their journey. Elizabeth assembled a team that included a Catholic priest, a paranormal investigator with 30 years of experience, a psychic medium, and 2 documentary filmmakers who would record everything that happened. The team met multiple times to plan their route, discuss contingencies, and practice the ritual that the priest had designed to help release trapped spirits. James spent those months in a state of anxiety mixed with grim determination. He knew that what he was planning was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but he also knew that Elizabeth was right. Someone had to try to end Martha's haunting, and James seemed to be the person fate had chosen for that task. He made out a will, updated his life insurance, and wrote letters to the few family members and friends he still had contact with, just in case he didn't come back. As November 7th, 2024 approached, the 1-year anniversary of James's first encounter with Martha, he found himself thinking not about his own safety, but about the young woman who had left prosperity on her October evening 71 years ago, excited about her wedding and her future, never imagining that she would never arrive at her destination. Martha Crane deserved peace. The drivers who had disappeared deserved justice, and the highways of America deserved to be free from supernatural predators that turned help into horror. On November 7th, James Porter and Elizabeth Crane's team set out on Route 50 just after dark. What happened that night remains a subject of debate and speculation. The documentary footage captured lights, shadows, and voices that some experts say prove the existence of the paranormal. Others claim it shows nothing more than natural phenomena misinterpreted by frightened people. What is documented beyond dispute is this: James Porter drove Route 50 from Charleston to Cumberland and back, a round trip of over 400 miles, and returned safely. Elizabeth Crane and her team conducted their ritual at multiple locations along the highway, including the spot where Martha's car was found and the bridge where James had driven through her ghost. And since that November night, there have been no new reports of drivers disappearing on Route 50. The bride in white no longer appears on foggy nights. The ghostly wedding party no longer blocks the road at the mountain summit. Whether Martha Crane finally found peace, whether she and Thomas Whitmore finally reunited in whatever lies beyond, whether the ritual worked or the haunting simply ended on its own, no one can say with certainty. But the drivers who travel Route 50 today drive a little easier, unaware that they pass safely through a place that once claimed lives with supernatural regularity. And somewhere, perhaps, a young woman in a wedding dress finally completed her journey, finally arrived, finally got to say the vows that were stolen from her 7 decades ago.